It was the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. A third-grade teacher in Riceville, Iowa, decided to do something that would change the way we understand prejudice forever. Jane Elliott didn't want to lecture her students about racism. She wanted them to feel it. She wanted them to live it. So, she stood before her class of all-white children and introduced a radical, controversial, and deeply uncomfortable experiment. The blue eyes, brown eyes exercise was born. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the setting. Riceville was a tiny, insulated town. The students had almost no exposure to people of different races. When Dr. King was killed, the children were confused. They asked their teacher why a man who wanted equality would be murdered. Jane Elliott realized she couldn't just explain the concept of racism to 8-year-olds. They needed a visceral, immediate experience. She walked to the front of the room on April 5, 1968. She told her students that people with blue eyes were superior. She claimed they were smarter, cleaner, and more civilized. She told them they were better than their classmates with brown eyes. The reaction was instantaneous. The power dynamic of the classroom shifted in a matter of seconds. The blue-eyed children were given special privileges. They got 5 extra minutes of recess. They were allowed to go back for seconds at lunch. They could sit at the front of the room. The brown-eyed children, however, were forced to wear fabric collars around their necks so they could be easily identified from a distance. They were told they couldn't drink from the same water fountain as the blue-eyed kids. They were prohibited from playing with the blue-eyed children on the playground. But the most chilling part wasn't the rules. It was the change in the children themselves. The blue-eyed children, who had been kind and friendly just an hour before, became arrogant and nasty. They adopted the language of bullies. They looked down on their friends. They used their new status to demean the brown-eyed students. The brown-eyed children, in contrast, became withdrawn and timid. Their academic performance tanked. They struggled with simple tasks they had mastered the day before. They looked like they had been beaten down by years of oppression, but it had only been a few hours. The next day, Jane Elliott flipped the script. She told the class she had lied. She claimed that brown-eyed people were actually the superior ones. The blue-eyed children were now the targets. She forced them to wear the collars. She subjected them to the same discrimination they had inflicted the day before. The result was the same. The children who had been the victims became the new oppressors, and the children who had been the bullies suddenly understood the pain of being labeled inferior. By the end of the exercise, the students were relieved to drop the labels. They cried. They hugged each other. They realized that their worth had nothing to do with their eye color. But why does this matter so much today? Because Jane Elliott proved that prejudice isn't inherent. It is taught. It is a social construct reinforced by systems of power. She demonstrated that when you create an environment where one group is privileged and another is marginalized, the behavior follows the power structure, regardless of who is in which group. Elliott's experiment was captured in the documentary The Eye of the Storm. It was later followed up in the documentary A Class Divided. Critics at the time were horrified. Parents complained. Some people argued that she had traumatized these children. They claimed it was unethical to manipulate kids like that. They said she was playing God with their social development. But Elliott argued that the real trauma was the world they were growing up in. She believed that letting them continue to exist in a bubble of ignorance was far more dangerous than the controlled environment of her classroom. She wasn't creating racism. She was holding up a mirror to the racism that already existed in American society. Let's look at the numbers. In the classroom, the academic performance gap was immediate. The children identified as inferior took longer to read. They took longer to solve math problems. They were physically slower. This shows that the environment we place people in dictates their capacity to succeed. If you tell a child they are stupid, they will act like they are stupid. If you treat a group as if they are inferior, they will be forced to spend all their energy fighting that label rather than learning or growing. Elliott faced immense backlash. She received death threats. Her career as a teacher was jeopardized. Yet she became a permanent figure in sociology. She took this exercise to corporations, to government agencies, and to prisons. She used it to show adults that the same biases that affected her third graders were governing their hiring practices, their boardrooms, and their policymaking. Think about the implications of the collar. It was a visible signifier of otherness. In real-world racism, the markers are different. skin color, dialect, geography, but the function is identical. The collar serves to remind the individual of their place in the hierarchy. It serves to remind the dominant group of their right to control that individual. Jane Elliott's experiment is rarely replicated today because institutional review boards would never allow it. The ethics of manipulating the psychological states of minors have shifted, but the core lesson remains one of the most powerful tools in anti-racism education. We are not born with hate. We are born with the capacity for empathy and the capacity for cruelty, and the environment we build determines which one dominates. Many people think of themselves as colorblind. They say, "I don't see race." Jane Elliott would tell you that's a mistake. She would say that if you don't see race, you aren't seeing the reality of the systems that dictate who gets the extra recess and who has to wear the collar. To ignore the difference is to ignore the structural inequality that the difference is used to justify. When you look at the footage of these children, you see the humanity underneath the labels, but you also see how fragile that humanity is. It took less than an hour to turn a classroom of best friends into enemies. That is the true power of structural prejudice. It works on a subconscious level, turning neighbors against neighbors and forcing people into roles they never chose. The blue eyes, brown eyes exercise forced these children to experience the pain of being judged for something they could not change. It is a biological lottery: eye color, skin color, place of birth. None of these things define our intelligence, our morality, or our value as human beings. Yet, in our society, we still build entire infrastructures based on these immutable traits. Elliott's work also highlights the concept of internalized oppression. When the brown-eyed children were told they were inferior, they started to believe it. They started to act like it. They lost their confidence. They became quiet and submissive. This is what happens in a society that tells specific groups they are less than their counterparts. They internalize that message until it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The blue-eyed children, on the other hand, experience the corruption of power. They learn that having privilege feels good, even when it's based on a lie. They learn that it's easy to justify bullying when the system says you're the good one. That lesson is arguably more important for the dominant group than the lesson learned by the marginalized group. It teaches the privileged to question why they are winning and to realize that their victory might be coming at the expense of someone else's dignity. If we look at the legacy of this exercise, we have to ask ourselves, how many collars do we still have in our society? How many systems do we support because they benefit us while ignoring the fact that they actively diminish the people around us? Jane Elliott didn't just teach a lesson about race, she taught a lesson about human nature. She showed us that we are all capable of being the oppressor if the conditions are right, and she showed us that we are all capable of being the victim if the society decides we don't fit the standard of the superior group. The experiment in Riceville ended in 1968, but the experiment in our society continues every single day. We walk around with invisible collars. We decide who gets the extra resources and who gets the extra scrutiny. We use data, we use tests, and we use social status to justify the hierarchies we've built. But Jane Elliott's students proved that these hierarchies are paper thin. They were shattered by a teacher with a few pieces of colored construction paper. Maybe the reason why Jane Elliott's exercise remains so controversial is not because of what she did to those children, but because of what it reveals about us as adults. We like to think we have evolved beyond that classroom in Iowa. We like to think that we aren't easily manipulated by the promise of superiority or the fear of being labeled inferior. But look at our politics, look at our media, look at the way we talk about us versus them. We are constantly being fed narratives about who is superior and who is holding us back. We are constantly being told who deserves the extra recess and who deserves the collar. The blue eyes, brown eyes exercise serves as a permanent warning. It tells us that empathy is a choice and prejudice is an invention. We choose to create these divisions. We choose to sustain them. We choose to pretend that they are natural and inevitable. The children in Jane Elliott's class eventually grew up. Some of them went back to work with her years later to discuss the impact of that day. They said it changed them forever. They said they never looked at another person the same way again. They were hyper-aware of the ways that prejudice manifests in the real world. They were inoculated against the easy path of discrimination. If one teacher in a small town in Iowa could spark such a profound realization in 8-year-olds, what could we do if we actually looked at the systems we participate in today? We often talk about solving racism, but perhaps the goal isn't just to solve it. Maybe the goal is to see it, to recognize the collar, to realize that every time we grant power to someone based on a superficial trait, we are participating in the same experiment that Jane Elliott conducted in 1968. The question isn't whether or not the experiment was ethical. The question is whether we are brave enough to admit that we are living inside the experiment right now. We are all the blue-eyed children. We are all the brown-eyed children. We are all the teacher holding the power to label others or the students receiving the label. The next time you see a person being treated as less than, ask yourself who decided they were inferior. Ask yourself what that person is being denied. And most importantly, ask yourself if you are wearing a collar you haven't yet learned to see. When we remove the labels, what is left? A human being. The same intelligence, the same potential, the same capacity for joy and sorrow. The only thing that changes is the system we put them in. Jane Elliott showed us the truth about ourselves. She showed us that we are fragile, we are suggestible, and we are easily corrupted. But she also showed us that we have the power to break the cycle. We can take off the collar. We can refuse to play the game. We can choose to see the human being instead of the eye color. History is watching. The students are watching. The question is, when the dust settles and the exercise ends, will you be proud of the role you played, or will you be one of the many who stood by, watched the labels be applied, and did nothing to take them off? The lesson of Riceville, Iowa, is that the system only has as much power as we give it. Every day is a chance to redefine the rules. Every interaction is an opportunity to break the cycle. Don't wait for a teacher to tell you what's right. Start looking for the collars yourself. Because until we recognize the artificial lines we draw between each other, we will continue to live in a classroom where some are born to win and others are born to be diminished, all based on a lie we tell ourselves about who is better. It's time to stop the experiment. It's time to look past the eyes and see the person. After all, the only thing that actually separates us is the distance we allow ourselves to create. What will you do when the bell rings and the class is over? Will you carry the lesson forward, or will you wait for the next teacher to tell you who to hate? The choice, as it has always been, is entirely yours.